Hello, and a very good morning, evening, or afternoon to you, depending on when you are tuning into this latest episode of Edie's Susty Talk video interview series. In the run-up to COP26, we are hearing from some different voices who haven't been on this series before to amplify their insight, and I'm delighted to have the co-founder, or simply founder, I think, and CEO of Business Fights Poverty, Zahid, on the line with me today. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Sarah, and thanks for the opportunity to join you today.
No, thanks for taking the time to tune in. I know it's a very busy time for well, everyone in this space really, so that's myself, yourself, and probably everyone else listening, so thank you for your time. I think you were saying off call you're dialing in from Spain today?
I am, yes.
Very jealous, very jealous. It's been sort of unbearable heat waves interspersed with very drizzly wet weather here on the south coast of the UK, so a little jealous. I think for the benefit of everyone listening, I know we haven't had Business Fights Poverty on for a Susty Talk before, so I think for that reason it'd be good to start with a bit of a dive into why you were motivated to set it up. And I realised that the corporate social and environmental space has evolved so much since then, but I'd love to hear about how that's been changing from your side as well.
Yeah, well, it's been quite a journey. So we've been going for about 16 years nearly, and there's two really interesting trends that I've seen in that period. One is the understanding within business of what they can contribute to society. So a shift, especially from philanthropic type activity, into understanding how you can really use your core business, how you can use your voice, and also an expectation amongst those in society around what business should do. And you know, the recent GlobeScan survey, well, back into the beginning of this year, something like 86% of people felt business should stand up on issues that people care about. So there's a real shift in what business can do and is expected to do, and that's one of the trends. The other is, you just look around the world today. I mean, the complex challenges that we're facing require us to collaborate in ways we've never done before and at a speed we've never done before. And really at Business Fights Poverty, we're all about finding, experimenting with ways to collaborate faster and more effectively, involving business and other stakeholders to deal with some of these really huge challenges that we're facing. I mean, I think on the plus side, if there is one from the pandemic, is it's really shown that we are connected and that we can do amazing things when we collaborate together. So yeah, that's really what drives us at Business Fights Poverty.
That brings me nicely on to what I was going to mention. So essentially I was on the website having a look ahead of this conversation, and there's just essentially two halves of the homepage, two focus area boxes. One says COVID-19 and the other climate justice. And you've said there about how the pandemic has prompted more boardrooms to think about their impact in broader society, whether their collaborations are actually effective, and how they can evolve them. But do you think it's also, from what you've been seeing, prompted more boardrooms to look at the intersections between the environment and society, really? So be that public health or the economy, the things that they benefit from, in a way that, as you said, is part of their core business now rather than a little add-on.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely seen that. I think one thing that's really struck us is, from the impact of the pandemic, is that of course we've all been impacted to some extent, but it's the most vulnerable people and most vulnerable communities that have been impacted the most. Deep inequalities and equities around gender, race, income have really sort of determined the way in which the pandemic has unfolded and the impact that it has had on people's lives, their livelihoods, their access to learning. And it's those very same deep inequities that are driving the impacts of climate change. I was just reading the recent IPCC report. I mean, one fact that that stood out to me is that since I was born just over 50 years ago, ground temperatures haven't risen as much in 50 years in something like 2,000 years in a 50-year period. So it's as they have in this 50-year period. So clearly the emphasis rightly has been on dealing with the impacts of the science of climate and thinking about net zero. And I've listened to a lot of your great podcasts and there's clearly a need to focus on taking action on climate change. But I think the big shift, and really the pandemic has shown this to some extent, is understanding the people aspects of that, the impacts of climate by gender, by race, by income, but also what will the impact be of the different strategies they're employing to address climate? How can we ensure that people have opportunities in the green transition and so on? And when we look across the sorts of issues that we typically would look at, such as gender or supplier resilience and all sorts of issues like that, actually there's a very strong common theme across what we've seen in the pandemic and what we're seeing in climate in terms of the disproportionate impact of those issues, the need to rethink about equity. And that's really what led us to think about climate justice as a concept. I mean, clearly it's been a concept for about 20 years or so, but with Harvard Kennedy School's Corporate Responsibility Initiative and Change by Degrees, we've been looking at how do you take a social lens to climate issues and also to climate action. And that's really been a very sort of, I think, interesting and important sort of area of study by all of us. I think the fact that we're speaking today, we come very much from the social side. I know you're very strong across the board, but especially on the environment. That really speaks to the importance of taking a joined up approach to this. And to your earlier question, one thing I'm really seeing quite strongly is even in market leading companies where they're very strong in climate and they're very strong on social, actually those are often very different teams. The targets are developed independently, and there's so much more need to think about how we integrate our approaches so that we're effective in both respects for people and planet.
For sure. I mean, the discussion about things being siloed is one that, I've had hundreds of times since I started here at Edie more than 3 years ago. And it's always that, as a sustainability professional, I am my own team, and that team sort of sits on the side. And then there's maybe one person doing the philanthropic work and they sit on the side, and how that has needed to change, and in some places is. So aside from, as you've mentioned there, the need to integrate those teams, what more can be done to help businesses apply that social lens and that scientific lens to their climate approach? What are you looking at the moment in that space?
Yeah, well, I suppose at a high level, there's three things any business can ask themselves. One is what are the equity issues around the risks that people face in your value chain, in fact, across your sphere of influence. And are there particular communities and people who are more impacted, maybe smaller businesses, maybe smallholder farmers, maybe particular groups that are impacted? So think about the equity issues in terms of risk of impact of climate. I think the second thing is think about the equity issues around the opportunities or people's access to the opportunities that can be created through a transition to a green economy, but also equity issues around people who might be left behind because they're in jobs that are maybe more in traditional carbon heavy type roles. And so that issue of equity of opportunity is huge. And in terms of, for example, gender, ensuring that women have access to those sorts of roles, access to STEM education and so on. And then the third maybe is around voice, because actually at the centre of this, and perhaps the central injustice of this, is that those who are most impacted have the least say in strategies to deal with it, and actually had the least to do with where we are right now in terms of the negative climate change impacts. And so how do you create voice in what you do, in how you think about the strategy for going forward? And so those are at a high level, I think, the three big things. But maybe in a bit more detail, what we've done with our work with Harvard Kennedy School and Change by Degrees is we've put together sort of a climate justice framework, and it's available for free actually on our website. But essentially, it's trying to understand in a sort of hopefully a simple matrix, how do you leverage your core business, your philanthropic efforts, and your policy and your voice across the three dimensions of impact. So that's lives, livelihoods, and access to learning. And there's something for everyone there in a sense, because no matter what your business, there's something that you can do in all of those areas, or at least some of those areas. And I think for any company, think about where you have the biggest impact and the biggest contribution to make. And I was just listening actually to your podcast around real estate, and I thought that was really interesting how a company that is in that space has really thought about from their perspective what is the biggest contribution they can make to the issue of climate. And what we're doing in climate justice is saying, well, take that same approach and think about what are the equity issues wrapped up in the climate conversation. Think about what is it you can bring. So we have some of our members are thinking, for example, around how can they strengthen the resilience of smallholder farmers? How can they even tackle the spikes that we're seeing in gender-based violence that is often associated with any climate disaster, but also more broadly with the pandemic, in fact. So there's different strategies that different companies can take that are relevant for them. I think one of the most exciting areas, though, is voice, in terms of how can companies come together to influence the direction of policy. I mean, in the politics of this, clearly we've seen some really positive shifts, both in the US and the UK. But even when that may not have been so much a case, business really stood up, I think, and pushed these issues to the fore of the conversation. And I think they need to do more of that going forward.
And I mean, for me, voice was a key takeaway of that IPCC report. Essentially, there's a lot of people understandably running to Twitter and asking, oh, what can I do personally? What's the one thing that I can do with my lifestyle or my house or my micro business that has 10 employees? And honestly, the recommendations have shifted from things like, oh, end your contracts that do plastic cups or plastic bottles towards, write to your MP or equivalent based on where you are in the world and ask what they're doing on this, or join some sort of campaign. Which brings me on to, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what Business Fights Poverty is planning in the run up to COP26 with that voice piece in mind. And are you going to go to Glasgow yourself?
Yeah, well, I think a really important point that I was thinking about as you were speaking was, we're all on a journey. So I think even if a company is strong on one or both of the areas of climate and social, actually that interconnection is, I think, a relatively new and complex area that we're all trying to work through. So we're all on a journey of how to do that better. And so for us, we're also on a journey trying to help people think through, how do you do this? So we've got plans from now through to COP around creating toolkits and advice and guidance and so on that. We're running peer circles on the topic. We have an event in the margins of the UN General Assembly, a Climate Justice Day on the 23rd of September. And then we're hoping to, around COP, we'll have a 3-day online event in the first week. We're hoping to do a physical event focused on how you can empower women through a green transition. If that goes ahead, then I'm hoping to come to Glasgow for that. I think one thing, and I'm sure you found this as a sort of outcome of the pandemic, is having to shift online like we are now. It also creates an opportunity to provide voice to those who are more proximate to the issues, who are impacted by the issues that we're talking about. And so for our events, we're really trying to lean into giving voice to the Global South, to people who are, if you like, at the front line of these issues. So our event at COP is with a Cameroonian NGO who's been working around empowering women in West Africa through solar and other sort of clean energy. And I think for all of us who've got reach and platforms, it's the question for us is, how do we create a platform for that voice to come into the conversations? Because to be honest, when we did events physically in New York or London or Oxford, that really wasn't the case. We weren't creating those platforms, certainly for us, well enough. And I think we've been forced to think about, in the new world, as we rebuild better, how can we permanently shift to making sure that we do create space for that conversation to happen? For
sure. I think that's been the question for everyone. And the question now as well will be, how do we keep it up, because I've seen so many great people in this space so keen to do that very important work over the past 18 months. So hoping it will continue. And I could stay and chat with you all afternoon, to be honest, but for now I'm going to have to close the interview, and hopefully if we're both in Glasgow at the same time, we can meet for a cup of coffee.
Absolutely, look forward to it. Thank you again.
Thank you.